The taste of dust, gritty and dry like fine ground concrete, clung to Matt Harper's lips. It was not a flavor he had expected to carry with him from the endless stretch of interstate into this corner of nowhere. He parked the rental Ford, a beige sedan with the weary look of 1,000 anonymous miles already behind it, outside the Rusty Nail Motel in Dudley, Maine's town square. The air settled, thick and piney, a deep breath drawn from the surrounding woods. It carried the heavy dampness of a hidden marsh, a lingering scent of decay and rich earth, suggesting a deeper, wilder presence than simple, clean air. Dusk already painted the sky overhead a flat, leaden gray, an oppressive color that swallowed up the last slivers of daylight without a whisper. Matt, a rationalist journalist by trade and temperament, adjusted the strap of his messenger bag. He was here to write a story, a simple expose on local anxieties. The editor, Steve, had been clear. Just wolves. Stick to facts, not folklore. That phrase, delivered with a short, dry knock of a knuckle on the desk, echoed in Matt's head, each syllable chipping away at his already strained patience. He pulled a lukewarm, cheap coffee from a plastic cup he had bought at a gas station an hour back. The chemical tang of instant coffee and the faintly plasticized taste of the cup itself mingled on his tongue, a bitter, unsatisfying prelude to the unfolding reality before him. His mission was to bring order to the chaos, to dissect local superstitions, and lay bare the mundane truth. He was good at that. He believed in that. His first stop had been Kevin Smith's ranch, a place that smelled of dry hay, manure, and an undercurrent of an acrid, faintly metallic scent. The silence there had been absolute, pressing down from the vast sky and rising from the indifferent fields. Smith, an old farmer whose face, carved by the relentless wind and sun of his land, spoke of years endured, led Matt to a corner of a pasture. The ground was churned. Dark earth clotted with a darker, congealed substance. Not wolves, Smith said, his voice a low rasp, hoarse like dried bark scraped across rough wood. Wolves tear. They're hungry, these dissect. He gestured with a gnarled hand toward the carcasses of 2 young calves, their bodies unnaturally intact, yet hollowed. Matt approached, his reporter's instinct overriding the immediate prickle of unease. The smell hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was not just blood, not the rich, earthy scent of a fresh kill he had encountered on other assignments. This was the sharp, metallic tang of raw iron, almost surgical, a smell that scraped against the back of his throat. It mixed with the faint, sickly sweet scent of whey and the fresh, turned-up earth. He saw the pattern then, a chilling order to the brutality. There were no wild, frenzied gashes. Instead, he saw precise, clean incisions. The flesh had been sliced open by an incredibly sharp instrument, exposing the internal cavities with disturbing neatness. The organs were gone. On the damp ground a little further off, he noticed the tracks. Deep, clear impressions of undeniable wolf paws, large and predatory. But interwoven with them, faint yet clear, were other prints. Boot prints. Slightly larger than human, they clearly showed the shape of a sole and heel. Their impressions were less defined, indicating a weight distributed differently. A lighter step. Matt stared at them, and he felt it then. The first faint tremor in the foundation of his rational world. The sturdy lock he had built around his mind, designed to keep out the illogical and the unprovable, groaned, a subtle rust now seizing its hinges. A cold sweat, not from the temperature but from a deeper fear, began to prickle on his back, dampening his shirt. Later that evening, in a local diner that smelled of old, burnt grease, stale beer, and an indefinable, unsettling odor, he found the talkative old man. The man sat hunched over a plate of lukewarm fries. His eyes, a strange mix of taiga wisdom and deep, abiding fear, avoided Matt's gaze. He spoke without looking up, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They hunt like people," he said, the words coming out in short, choppy bursts. "And they eat like beasts." It was a simple phrase, accented with a local drawl, but it struck Matt with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last layers of his professional skepticism. The old man's words were too simple, too direct, too unsettling to be easily dismissed. Back in his motel room at the Rusty Nail, the single fluorescent light casting a jaundiced glow on the faded wallpaper, Matt sat at the chipped Formica desk. He typed his initial report, unexplained attacks, characteristic of a highly organized predator. He stared at the word predator. The word felt inadequate, too conventional. He backspaced, deleting the word with a sharp click, and replaced it with a single, chilling alternative. Something. He looked down at his left wrist, where thin blue veins traced faint pathways beneath the skin, a map of ordinary human biology. The world, he reminded himself, was simple and logical. For now. But the taste of dust and the phantom smell of raw iron lingered, a disquieting presentiment. The familiar landscape shifted, revealing something vast and hungry beneath its thin, fragile crust. He felt a deep, resonant thump in his chest, an echo of the fear he struggled to categorize, to understand, to put into a neat little box that he now knew would not hold it. The silence of the motel room pressed in, suddenly not empty, but full of unseen presences. The air in John Rowell's office was a dense, dark atmosphere, a thick blend of scents that had steeped and mingled over years. The rich, sweet smell of cherry pipe tobacco, not freshly lit, but ingrained into the very fabric of the room, mingled with the earthy aroma of old leather. The worn armchair by the window, the scuffed briefcase on the floor, the very binding of the books stacked precariously on shelves. The surrounding forest had slowly exhaled its essence into this small, cramped space, creating the sharp, bracing scent of aged pine. John himself was a man forged by that landscape, tall and wiry, his frame hardened by years of patrolling the vast, unforgiving woods. His face was impenetrable, a slab of granite carved by unseen forces, unyielding and severe. His eyes, the color of wet slate, held a direct, heavy gaze that bore right through Matt, assessing, weighing, judging. Matt sat on a creaky wooden chair, a chair that had cradled countless forms, feeling the cold weight of John's silence. It was not an unfriendly silence, but one pregnant with unspoken truths, with the heavy burden of experience. John finally spoke, his voice low, a rumbling baritone that vibrated with the very air in the room. He spoke of his brother, a younger man named David, who had disappeared on a hunt some years back. The words were delivered calmly, without a flicker of emotion on that granite face. Yet Matt felt the faint, unmistakable pulse of deep anxiety beneath John's surface, a grief locked away but never truly forgotten. John pushed a faded photograph across the desk. A young man, David, with a wide, easy smile and eyes that sparkled with the sheer joy of living. Those eyes, so full of laughter and unburdened hope, stood in stark contrast to the quiet, haunted resignation Matt now saw in John's own face. The weight of that difference. The chasm between the lively image and the current, crushing silence was palpable, pressing down on Matt like the oppressive sky over Dudley. "You're not looking for truth," John said, his voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. "You're looking for death." It was not a piece of advice, Matt realized, but a verdict delivered with the stark finality of a judge's gavel. The words were short, choppy, each one a hammer blow. John then leaned forward, his elbows resting on the scarred desktop. "Normal horror," he explained, his gaze unwavering. "That is a bear. Or a mountain lion gone rabid. Something you understand. Something that makes sense. Their horror." He paused, the silence stretching taut between them, "is the logic of what happens out there in the night." He pushed aside some papers and spread an old, crinkled map across the table. It was the topographical map of the region, crisscrossed with faint blue lines for rivers and streams, green smudges for forests, and dotted with tiny, anonymous roads. But on this map, something else stood out. Red ink, vibrant and disturbing against the faded paper, marked various points in the dense wilderness. Each mark, Matt knew, represented a disappearance, a silent, terrifying void. As John's bony finger traced the marks, Matt saw that they formed an irregular semicircle around the town, a gaping maw. "Their corridor," John murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as he outlined the area with his finger. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Matt, the self-proclaimed rationalist, felt the familiar urge to intellectualize, to categorize, to find a scientific explanation for what he was seeing. He considered a rogue pack of hybrid dogs or a survivalist cult with twisted ritualistic practices. He mentally tossed these ideas around, trying to make them stick. But as he looked at the map, at the sheer density of those red marks, each one a silent scream, he felt a cold, hard truth begin to coalesce, a reality that lay stubbornly outside the boundaries of his understanding. His knuckles, he noticed, were white where they gripped the edge of the wooden table, the wood rough against his skin. It was not just a map, it was a testament. A long, rambling monologue poured out of Matt then, an attempt to articulate the desperate need to understand, to see with his own eyes. It was less an argument for his article and more a plea for personal validation. A journalist's fervent declaration that he must see everything, not for the sake of a sensational headline, but for the clarity of his own increasingly troubled mind. He needed to understand the mechanics of this creeping dread, to strip away the folklore and find the terrifying physical core. John listened, silent, impassive, as Matt spoke, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Matt's shoulder. He reached for a pipe, tamped tobacco into its bowl with a methodical calm, and lit it with a practiced hand, the small flare of the match briefly illuminating the lines etched around his eyes. He drew a long, slow breath, letting the fragrant smoke curl around his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice short, clipped, devoid of further argument. "Tomorrow at dawn, you walk into my fear." Back in his motel room, the heavy, worn backpack felt solid and reassuring against Matt's shoulder as he packed it. He checked his digital voice recorder, the batteries charged and ready. He clicked in a fresh set as a precaution. He believed in technology, in the precise, quantifiable logic of things. He believed in the lens of a camera, the unwavering eye of a recorder, the objective truth of data. But even as he made these practical preparations, A thin, almost imperceptible thread of fear had already begun to stretch deep within his consciousness. It was not the blunt, immediate fear of danger, but a subtle, insidious dread, a cold tendril reaching out from the unknown. The silence in the room, usually a comfort, now became unnaturally deep, a canvas awaiting the brushstrokes of the unspeakable. The world he thought he knew, orderly and predictable, quietly, inexorably, began to unravel. They entered the forest before the first light broke fully. The air was sharp, an icy bite that scoured the inside of Matt's nostrils, leaving a bitter taste of pine needles on his tongue. The ground beneath their feet was a soft, yielding carpet, springing gently with each step, composed of centuries of fallen needles and thick, damp moss. The sun was still a rumor on the horizon, not yet risen, only a thin, gray streak painting the eastern sky, a faint promise of day that the oppressive canopy of pines swallowed. John walked ahead, a silent, imposing figure. His movements were economical, each step placed with a precision born of intimate knowledge of the terrain, utterly noiseless. He did not speak, not a single unnecessary word. Silence was his primary tool, a language he understood and wielded with practiced ease. He did not just walk through the forest. He read it like an old, much-read book, its pages familiar yet always capable of revealing a new detail. Matt, following clumsily in John's wake, felt heavy and awkward, his city-softened gait betraying his alien presence in this ancient, indifferent wilderness. Every crackle of a branch under his boot, every rustle of dry leaves, sounded like a thunderclap in the profound quiet. John stopped abruptly by a massive fallen pine, its trunk scarred and moss-covered. He knelt, pointing to the soft, dark earth near its root ball. There, etched with chilling clarity, were the prints. Deep, clawed impressions unlike anything Matt had ever seen. They were too large for a wolf, too defined for a bear, with a strange, articulated quality to the toes. Matt, driven by a morbid curiosity and a reporter's need to touch, to feel, knelt and pressed his fingers into one of the tracks. The soil was cold, damp, and unexpectedly viscous, clinging to his fingertips, a texture that held within it the very essence of the forest's secrets. It was not just mud. It was something profoundly unsettling. "These are they," John whispered, his voice a low rumble. He pointed, tracing patterns in the earth. The tracks always go in pairs, one heavy, one light. He paused, looking back into the silent depths of the trees. "They don't look for their prey, Matt. They herd it." John used a chilling word, utterly out of place in this wild setting. Shepherds. Matt saw the disturbing image bloom in his mind. An unseen, silent cordon, moving with impossible coordination, pushing terrified, bewildered animals or people toward an unseen trap. The implication settled over him like a shroud. As they moved deeper, the pervasive quiet deepened into an unnatural stillness. The chirping chorus of hidden birds, which had been a faint background hum, suddenly ceased. The buzzing of unseen insects, a constant presence in any summer woods, simply vanished. An absolute oppressive silence descended, thick and heavy. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical presence. A vacuum that pressed on Matt's eardrums, leaving an unpleasant, high-pitched ringing in his head. His breath caught in his throat, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. The sun, though it had theoretically risen, offered no warmth, no illumination. Its rays simply did not penetrate the dense, thick canopy of the ancient pines. The forest remained locked in an eternal twilight, a perpetual state of deepening dusk, where shadows clung to the ground like hungry specters. The profound contrast between the bright, logical world Matt carried in his head, a world of deadlines and verifiable facts, and the dark, primordial reality of the forest where light itself feared to tread, began to gnaw at his composure. Matt tried to explain it away. The silence, he reasoned, was merely an odd atmospheric condition, a peculiarity of the local wildlife. The tracks? He considered an unknown mutation, a unique breed of forest predator. He clung to these rationalizations with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a flimsy raft. But the density of the coincidences, the sheer overwhelming accumulation of anomalies, no longer fit neatly into his comfortable scientific boxes. He felt it then, a tangible shift within him. His reliable shell of rationalism, built carefully over years of journalistic skepticism, developed a thin, barely perceptible crack, a hairline fracture that widened. The fear he now felt was no longer external, no longer a professional detachment from a story of local unease. It was internal, cold, and insidious, a serpent uncoiling in the deepest recesses of his mind, whispering of things that defied every logic he knew. The damp stickiness of the earth on his fingers lingered, a persistent, unsettling reminder. As night descended again, they made camp beside a small, gurgling stream, its water an inky blackness under the looming trees. John, with an economy of motion, built a small, modest fire, coaxing reluctant flames from dry tinder and kindling. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and clean, mixed with the pervasive smell of wet, clayey earth, a smell evoking ancient dampness and hidden things. The stream's water was cold, shockingly so, and Matt drank deeply, feeling the icy liquid penetrate inside him, chilling his core in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. He knew it was a necessary ritual, a small comfort against the vast, encroaching darkness. Matt woke abruptly from a fitful doze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Deep night. The fire had dwindled to a heap of glowing embers, casting dancing, elongated shadows. And then he heard it, a short, high whistle. It was not the call of a bird, nor the cry of any animal he knew. This was a sound that was mechanically precise, utterly lacking the organic imperfection of nature. It was like a human signal, but one delivered on an inhale, a breath drawn in sharply, creating a thin, unnerving tone that cut through the heavy air. The whistle repeated, then again, from a different point in the impenetrable blackness, echoing through the pines. Then a third, more distant, yet still distinct. Matt looked across the dying embers at John, whose eyes were two dark, unreadable points in the faint light. John's voice, a barely audible whisper, cut through the quiet dread. They are building a corridor. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. A corridor. For what? For whom? Around their small, flickering camp, an absolute silence descended, even more profound than the one they had experienced earlier in the day. The forest had gone utterly still. But Matt did not just hear nothing. He felt movement. It was not the crunch of footsteps, not the rustle of leaves. It was a subtle shift in the air pressure, a hidden current that indicated a vast, coordinated movement. He felt a stealthy, perfectly synchronized tread, the advance of multiple beings that made no sound. Yet their presence was overwhelmingly palpable, a pressure on his skin, a vibration in the earth itself. John, staring into the embers, began to speak, not to Matt but to himself, an internal monologue given voice. First, block, he murmured, outlining shapes in the air with his bony finger. One herds. A fourth waits at the point of impact. He spoke of military logic, of an ambush, of an intricate chilling strategy applied in the wild, untamed forest. The stark contrast between the raw, ancient wilderness and the cold, calculated precision of the hunt was terrifying. It was not primal, instinctual savagery. It was intelligent, orchestrated, and utterly devoid of mercy. Then, the smell. It began subtly, a faint, barely perceptible wisp, but quickly intensified. It was the smell of metal, the same raw iron scent Matt had encountered at Smith's ranch, but now more concentrated, denser, almost suffocating. It settled in his nostrils, thick and viscous, a nauseating premonition of violence. He swallowed dryly, his throat suddenly constricted, the metallic tang blooming on his tongue. This was not just a scent carried on the breeze. It was an aura, a signature, an announcement. At the very edge of the dwindling firelight where the impenetrable shadow began, Matt saw them. Two glowing points, an unsettling, luminous yellow. They were absolutely motionless, not blinking, not shifting, utterly unwavering. They looked directly at him, with an unnerving intensity that penetrated his very soul. He held his breath, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to even blink. A short, chopped realization slammed into him with visceral force. We are seen. It was not just a fleeting glimpse. It was a profound, chilling certainty. The eyes were watching, gauging, waiting. The hunt was not just in the distance. It had encircled them, and Matt, with a cold dread that seized him whole, knew they were now the prey. The forest had become a meticulously planned trap, and they were caught within its jaws. The glowing eyes at the edge of the firelight vanished as abruptly as they had appeared, leaving behind a blacker, more absolute darkness. Matt heard John's short, sharp inhale, a sound of grim recognition, and understood immediately. They were surrounded. The darkness around them became physical, a heavy, suffocating velvet pressing in from all sides. He now heard the steps, not quite silent anymore, but slightly louder, a dry, deliberate crunch of branches and pine needles under an unseen weight. They came from 3 distinct directions, closing the ring. To the river. Run. John's voice, usually a deep rumble, was now a low, guttural cry of urgency. He grabbed Matt's arm with an iron grip, and they bolted. They ran blindly, stumbling over roots and unseen obstacles. The rough bark of trees scraping Matt's arm, the forest a chaotic, unyielding barrier. A burning pain bloomed in Matt's side, a stitch from the sudden, desperate exertion. But the adrenaline coursing through him overshadowed it, turning it into a dull throb. They plunged into the icy water of the stream, the shock of the cold a violent contrast to the searing heat of Matt's fear. The cold was sharp, brutal, sucking the air from his lungs, a physical punch that momentarily stole his breath. They pushed through the current, the frigid water swirling around their chests, staying in the middle, away from the banks. The moving water washed away their scent, erased their trail. Each step was a battle against the current and the numbing cold, a desperate attempt to become invisible. Dawn, a watery, anemic light, eventually broke through the distant trees. They crawled out onto the bank, soaked and shivering, Matt's teeth chattering uncontrollably. His clothes were heavy, clinging to him like a second skin, clammy and cold. A few feet from their abandoned campsite, where the embers had long since died, they found them. 2 distinct tracks. One, a clear, predatory paw print, impossibly large and deeply impressed into the damp earth. The other, the familiar boot print, slightly larger than human, distinctly out of place yet inextricably linked. Matt's mind, reeling from the night's terror, processed it. He muttered a short, choppy phrase to himself, a grim realization crystallizing in his consciousness. They don't disguise themselves. They exist on the edge. This was not some cinematic shape-shifting, a crude transformation between forms. This was a deeper, more unsettling duality, an existence integrated into the very fabric of nature, a terrifying cohabitation of two disparate forms within a single, horrifying entity. John, his face grim, moved toward an old cedar tree nearby. On its weathered trunk he found a mark. It was not a casual scratch from a passing animal, but a deep, clawed symbol carved with deliberate intent. Matt could not read its language, a glyph of unknown meaning, yet he instinctively understood its message. A threat, stark and undeniable, left for them. It was a warning, a declaration of intent, a confirmation that they had been seen, pursued, and found wanting. Matt felt a profound internal shift, a seismic tremor in the core of his being. He was no longer the skeptical journalist, the detached observer. The neatly constructed edifice of his rationalism had shattered, its pieces scattered by the raw, primal fear that now consumed him. It was a fear that smelled of river mud and the sickeningly sweet tang of iron, a visceral terror that bypassed intellect and spoke directly to the oldest, most buried parts of his brain. He realized then with a chilling certainty that his life, his very existence, was now a target. He had crossed an invisible line, had witnessed too much, and in doing so, had become irrevocably intertwined with the very horror he had come to expose. The cold, wet air on his face felt like a chilling caress, a final, unsettling confirmation of his transformation from observer to prey. The return to Dudley felt less like a homecoming and more like an unwelcome invasion. The sun, finally high in the sky, was unnaturally bright, almost blinding after the perpetual twilight of the forest. The sounds of the small town, the distant hum of a truck, the faint chatter of voices from the diner, the mundane symphony of everyday life, were too loud, almost painful to Matt's ears. He tasted ash on his tongue, a phantom flavor, though nothing had burned, a lingering residue of the terror he had just endured. The vibrant, ordinary world now was brittle, a thin veneer over an unimaginable abyss. The stark contrast with the absolute silence of the deep woods was disorienting, a jarring collision of two irreconcilable realities. Back in the motel room, Matt spread his notes across the desk, his hands still trembling slightly. He imposed order on the chaos to systematize his observations. The short, high whistle, the noiseless, coordinated steps in the dark, the impossibly clear, predatory paw prints mingled with the larger-than-human boot prints. It was not random, he realized, his mind racing, connecting the disparate pieces. It was a system, a chillingly intelligent, meticulously organized system. He felt a deep, unsettling thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts, the gears of his journalist's brain grinding, grasping the ungraspable. He began to understand the chilling logic of the hunt, piecing it together from John's terse explanations and his own terrifying observations. The first element, cutting off. Their primary objective was to block any avenues of escape. They did not just hunt. They orchestrated. They silently, invisibly, cut off roads, blocked familiar trails, using the profound silence of the forest and the unsettling, pervasive smell to create a psychological dead end for their prey. The victim, disoriented and panicked, funneled into their design. Then came the second element, herding. Once the escape routes were sealed, the hunt became a slow, methodical drive. The prey was not abruptly startled or terrified into a frenzy. Instead, it was subtly, inexorably directed. Like water flowing into a narrow trough, the victim guided along a predetermined path, their panic increasing with each silent, unseen push, moving them toward a pre-selected point, a specific location chosen with chilling foresight. And finally, the third most terrifying element, the strike. Only at the very end, when the victim had been perfectly positioned, the attack came. It was not a chaotic, frenzied tearing. It was a single, clean, utterly surgical strike. Precise accuracy, delivered with an efficiency that spoke not of animal instinct, but of cold, calculating reason. This chilled Matt to his core far more than any display of savage wildness would have. It was the intelligence, the disturbing logic behind the horror that truly unsettled him. John, his face etched with grim resignation, sat hunched over his own maps at a table in the motel room. He was marking new points of disappearance, adding more red ink to the already disturbing pattern. The sector was expanding, pushing further out from Dudley, the irregular semicircle of previous attacks now a vast, slowly opening jaw, its teeth sharp and unseen, ready to snap shut. Matt watched him, feeling the palpable weight of the threat growing heavier, the map itself vibrating with unseen menace under John's steady hand. The sheer scale of it, the cold, methodical expansion, was terrifying. Even in the relative sanctuary of his motel room, the memory of that sickeningly sweet metallic odor, the scent of raw iron mixed with whey, clung to Matt. He opened the window, letting in the faint aroma of pine and diesel from the street below. But the smell remained, tenacious, ingrained in his olfactory memory, a phantom presence that refused to be dismissed. It was their scent, their invisible aura, a chilling reminder that even in the heart of civilization, their presence was real, tangible, and terrifyingly close. He knew now that the familiar world was merely a thin curtain, and behind it, a more ancient, more terrifying logic slowly but surely asserted its undeniable claim. They were back in the woods that night, this time closer to the outskirts, perched in a makeshift ambush on a low ridge overlooking a game trail. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Matt felt a bitter taste of fear on his tongue, acrid and metallic, mixed with the sharp tang of anticipation. It was not just fear for his life, but a deeper, more profound dread of what he would witness, what he would confirm. This was no longer just a story. It was a confrontation with the unspeakable. Deep night again. The expected whistle sounded, a short, precise signal echoing through the pines. But then, a different sound. A low, vibrating hum, a resonant thrum that Matt felt not just in his ears, but in his chest, a deep vibration that emanated from the very ground beneath him. It resonated like the tension of a massive, unseen string pulled taut, humming with barely contained energy, a sound of immense power just beneath the surface of hearing. Then they saw him, a young man in his early 20s, his face pale and contorted with fear, his eyes wide, dilated pupils reflecting the faint starlight. He was lost, clearly disoriented, running in a distinct, almost predetermined trajectory along the game trail, guided by an invisible force, trapped beneath an unseen dome. His movements were jerky, desperate, an embodiment of pure, unadulterated panic. Matt observed, his journalist mind, despite the mounting terror, meticulously recording every detail. Two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the trees, moving with an impossible fluidity, silently cutting off the man's only path to the distant road. They did not rush him. They simply appeared, blocking his escape with the cold precision of a well-oiled machine. Then a third, taller shadow emerged from the darkest part of the forest, an entity that was blacker, more substantial than any normal animal, its form vaguely lupine yet disturbingly upright, its limbs too long, too agile. The pattern of the strike, which Matt had intellectually understood, now unfolded before his terrified eyes in stark, visceral reality. The creature moved with horrifying speed, a short, choppy action. It did not pounce or tear. It simply jumped, covering the distance in a single fluid motion. The strike was precise, impossibly fast, aimed directly at the young man's neck. There was no scream, no prolonged struggle. The victim simply fell, silently, his body crumpling to the ground without a sound, all breath and life instantly extinguished. The creatures did not linger. They did not tear at the body, did not feed. They simply retreated, melting back into the shadows with the same silent efficiency with which they had appeared. The victim lay motionless on the ground, yet Matt realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that he was not dead. He was still alive, his chest rising and falling faintly in the dim light. "They left a mark," John whispered, his voice raspy, confirming Matt's unspoken fear. A wave of inexplicable, lingering nausea washed over Matt, a sticky, cloying sensation that went deeper than simple revulsion. His journalistic instinct, fused with a desperate human impulse, surged. He had to go to him, had to help. He rushed toward the fallen man to break cover, to cross the invisible boundary that separated witness from participant. John, anticipating his move, grabbed his arm with surprising strength, a vice-like grip, but Matt, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate moral impulse, tore free. He had crossed the line. The contrast between John's cold, calculated logic of survival and Matt's raw, moral impulse was stark. He had broken the rules, not just of observation, but of self-preservation, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the consequences would be dire. He was no longer just watching. He was part of their grim design. Matt stumbled over to the half-dead man, his hands already fumbling for a sign of life, a way to help. The air around the victim was thick with the overpowering scent of fresh, hot blood, a sickly, sweet aroma that made his stomach churn. But mingled with it, sharp and acrid, was that same concentrated smell of rust, the metallic note that he now associated inextricably with the creatures. It permeated everything, a suffocating blanket. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat, and saw the wound on the man's neck. It was not a savage tear, not the mauling he might have expected from a wild beast. Instead, there were two deep, pinpoint punctures. Impossibly precise, a pair of needles had been driven into the flesh. The wound was not bleeding, not in the conventional sense. Instead, it pulsated from within, a faint rhythmic throb beneath the broken skin. A sickening fascination held Matt transfixed. The man on the ground began to move, not with the natural, fluid movements of the living, but with a series of jerky mechanical convulsions. It moved like a mechanism, slowly, laboriously straightening out, limbs extending with a terrible stiffness. His eyes, fixed and staring, began to cloud over, losing their human depth, their pupils dilating into vacant pools. Then, with a horrifying snap, they cleared, turning a vibrant, unnatural yellow, exactly like the eyes Matt had glimpsed in the absolute darkness around their camp. "Drop him, Matt. He's already one of them." John's cry, raw and guttural, tore through the unnatural silence, a desperate warning. Matt froze, his hand still hovering inches from the man's chest. He looked at the face, the features blurring, shifting, the skin stretching taut across the bone, the human semblance dissolving before his eyes. It was a terrifying, rapid metamorphosis. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, the man's arm shot out, his hand clamping around Matt's left wrist. Pain, sharp and burning, exploded through Matt's arm. He cried out, a guttural sound of shock and agony, and recoiled violently, tearing his wrist free. The action was short, brutal, decisive. He felt a damp, hot stickiness on his hand, the chilling residue of that impossible touch. Trembling, Matt stumbled backward, crashing into John, who caught him, his grip surprisingly strong. Matt's mind, reeling, grasped the terrible truth. They did not hunt for sustenance. A frantic internal monologue scrambled for understanding. They hunted for expansion. The purpose was not to kill and consume. It was to transmit, to convert. The victims were not food. They were simply new members, new vectors for this terrifying, self-replicating process. In the faint, jaundiced light of John's powerful flashlight, Matt looked at his wrist. There, etched into his skin, a thin, red, barely visible crescent, a series of microscopic punctures, a delicate, horrific tattoo. It burned, a deep, persistent ache that throbbed with a sickly rhythm. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic drum against his ribs. He instinctively pulled his sleeve down, covering the mark, to hide it, to deny its very existence. But the burning was real, the horror undeniable, a silent, terrifying accusation etched onto his flesh. He knew with a cold certainty that his world had just irrevocably changed. They made it back to John's makeshift shelter, a small, insulated cabin tucked deep in the woods. Just as the first hints of dawn bled across the sky, Matt could not speak. His throat was constricted. A metallic taste, bitter, coppery, a mixture of guilt and fear, coated his tongue. The pain in his wrist pulsed, a dull throb that foreshadowed something far worse than a simple wound. He ripped a strip of cloth from an old shirt, wrapping it tightly around the mark, a futile attempt to staunch the invisible flow of dread. John, his face worn and etched with years of quiet grief, now looked truly aged, the weight of a lifetime of unspeakable knowledge pressing down on him. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, his words heavy with resignation. They were human, he explained, staring into the flickering flame of a small kerosene lamp, or a semblance of it, an infection that seeks consciousness. He painted a terrifying picture with his words, a dense, saturated description of a relentless, horrifying cycle. The hunt, the mark, the transformation, and finally, the joining of the newly converted into the ever-growing pack. It was a self-sustaining horror, a biological imperative turned monstrous. Matt listened, a profound, cosmic existential dread settling over him. These were not just monsters, not beasts in the conventional sense. This was a process, a logical, self-reproducing system, as elegant and terrifying as any natural law. It was a system that systematically eliminated humanity, not through violent consumption, but through a chilling, complete replacement of consciousness, replacing individual identity with a primal, unified hunting instinct. It was not about savagery. It was about conversion, about assimilation. They sat by a small, grimy window in the cabin. Outside, the bright daylight of a summer morning, crisp and clear, illuminated the forest. Inside, the deep shadows clung to the corners, a persistent, physical presence. The contrast between the stark, cheerful light of the outside world and the profound, internal darkness of what they had witnessed, what they knew, emphasized the absolute irrationality of the phenomenon, its terrifying intrusion into a once normal, illuminated world. Matt began to understand the chilling function of the recurring elements, the subtle cues they used in their hunts. The pervasive, unnatural silence was not just a side effect. It was a weapon, a psychological barrier that prevented escape, disorienting prey, twisting their perceptions. The metallic scent, that ubiquitous smell of raw iron, was not just a byproduct of their presence. It was an aura, a physiological signature, a way of marking territory, of announcing their advance, of subtly conditioning the environment to their will. It was all a calculated, horrifying design. He tried desperately to cling to the last vestiges of his rational mind, to explain away the horror. He considered an unknown virus, a rapidly spreading contagion that mimicked lycanthropy. He considered a mass hallucination brought on by an unknown neurotoxin in the local water. He clutched at these flimsy explanations, these last hooks of sanity. But the physical pain in his wrist, the sharp burning throb, a raw, undeniable sensation that cut through his rationalizations with brutal clarity, shattered them all. The wound was real. The bite was real. The transformation was real. Matt looked down at his bandaged hand. The dirty rag hid little of the insistent throbbing beneath. He accepted it then, with a profound, terrifying certainty. The world was not explainable by his editor's simple dictates. He was no longer just a reporter and observer of facts. He was a witness to something ancient, something utterly alien, something that transcended human understanding, a purposeful, relentless force that slowly, systematically, consumed the familiar world. The silence in the cabin deepened, no longer just the quiet of the woods, but the vast, indifferent silence of a universe that harbored horrors beyond human comprehension. He was part of it now. Matt wrote, hunched over his laptop in the dim light of the motel room, the words spilling onto the screen in a desperate, feverish torrent. It was a long, rambling, descriptive period, capturing the raw, inchoate terror he had witnessed. He struggled with the inadequacy of language, the inability of mere words to contain the enormity of what he had seen, what he now knew. He forced out the truth, each sentence laden with the phantom smells of pine and iron, the bitter taste of fear, the chilling tang of non-death. It was a confession, an accusation, a warning, all rolled into one. He included every detail, every chilling observation, the short, precise whistle that coordinated the hunt, the telltale double tracks, the predatory paw and the slightly oversized boot, a testament to their duality. The surgical precision of the attacks, the clean, calculated incisions, the horrifying concept of non-death, the transformation of victims into something else, something terrifyingly familiar, yet utterly alien. He laid bare the chilling logic of the phenomenon, stripping away the mystery and revealing a mechanism of pure, unadulterated horror. He did not just report. He confessed, he exposed, he unveiled the raw, ugly truth. The reply from Steve, his editor, came quickly, a blunt, brutal email that felt like a physical blow. The words were short, chopped, utterly dismissive. Too wild a fantasy, it read. Rewrite. Need facts about wild beasts. The rational world, the world of verifiable facts and acceptable narratives, had summarily rejected his truth. They wanted neatly packaged, digestible explanations, not the raw, indigestible horror Matt now carried within him. Matt felt the physical pain of that rejection, a hollow ache in his chest that mirrored the throbbing in his wrist. He was utterly, terribly alone with his knowledge, cast adrift from the world he once belonged to. The silence in his rented room, once merely a lack of noise, now became something oppressive, a vast conspiracy of the world against an inconvenient, unthinkable truth. It was not just his editor dismissing him. It was the entire edifice of civilization, built on comforting lies and rational explanations, turning its back on the encroaching darkness. He picked up a blank sheet of paper, a crisp white rectangle, the very symbol of official truth, of the accepted narrative. Then he looked at his bandaged wrist, the dirty rag covering the wound, the living, throbbing symbol of the unspeakable horror that had imprinted itself on his flesh. The contrast between the pristine blankness of the paper and the stained, marked reality of his body struck him with the force of a physical blow, a harsh reminder of the chasm between what the world would accept and what he now knew to be terrifyingly real. John, his face grim, his eyes holding a profound weariness mixed with resolute acceptance, confirmed Matt's growing dread. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We know too much. They'll be coming for us now." He sensed it, Matt knew, the subtle shift in the forest, the tightening of the unseen noose. The hunt was advancing, and they, the inconvenient witnesses, were now the next targets. Matt looked at John, seeing in his eyes not despair but a quiet, ancient understanding of the inevitable. Matt probed his wrist, his fingers tracing the bandage. The mark beneath, it was not healing. It pulsed slightly, a faint, insistent thrum beneath the skin, a foreign body, an unwelcome invader asserting its presence. It was an unpleasant, deeply unsettling sensation, a quiet but persistent reminder that the transformation had begun, a seed of horror planted deep within his own flesh. The taste of ink and fear was still strong in his mouth, the metallic tang a constant companion, a testament to the truth that no one would believe. They left, pushing the worn Ford sedan through the winding back roads that skirted the edge of the sprawling forest. But as they drove, the sky opened up, and rain began to fall, a steady, insistent drumming on the roof and windshield. The clean, earthy smell of wet pine, usually so invigorating, failed to drown out the horrifyingly familiar, intensifying scent of metal. Now it was everywhere, clinging to the damp air, invading the car's interior, an invisible shroud that followed them. It was not just a smell, it was a presence, a tangible declaration of their pursuer's proximity. Then they saw them. Not in the woods, not on some remote trail, but on the black asphalt of a deserted stretch of highway. The double tracks, the clear predatory paw print and the slightly oversized boot, were etched into the wet pavement, a chilling, indelible pattern. The sight slammed into Matt with a shocking finality, a visceral confirmation that the boundaries were truly erased. The forest was no longer a contained realm of terror. It had bled into civilization, the asphalt roads no longer offering sanctuary, but merely an extension of the hunting ground. That night, pulled off onto the shoulder of a logging road, with the rain still falling in a soft, incessant patter, Matt could not sleep. His eyes, burning with fatigue, scanned the tree line. He saw them again, the yellow eyes. But this time there were not just two. There were 4, 6 more, scattered among the deeper shadows, glowing with an eerie, predatory luminescence. They were watching, patient and unblinking. The rain-slicked branches, the play of light and shadow from the distant unseen moon, made them elusive, appearing and disappearing with a maddening, phantom-like quality, their presence a silent, chilling accusation. A terrible, dawning realization coalesced in Matt's mind, sharper and colder than the night air. This was not a mere pack, not just a group of animals or even shapeshifters. This was a colony, not animal in its organizational structure, but something far more sophisticated, a truly social entity with a chilling, unified purpose. The hunt, he understood, was not just about sustenance or territory. It was about construction. They were not merely preying on the environment. They actively reformatted it, molding it to their own horrifying design, expanding their reach, assimilating, converting, building something alien and vast. He thought of the victim he had witnessed, the young man whose eyes had clouded then cleared to an unnatural yellow. Matt felt a profound internal monologue unfold, a descent into a deeper, more existential horror. Its loss of identity, he whispered to himself, the words catching in his throat. A complete replacement of consciousness. The human mind overwritten by a hunting program. The depth of this horror was immeasurable. It was not just death. It was the obliteration of self, the erasure of everything that made one human, replaced by a cold, relentless, predatory imperative. Then, the burning on his wrist intensified, a searing pain that made him gasp. He looked down, his heart hammering. The faint red mark on his wrist was now an angry blue, and around it a fine, gray network of veins spread. Tiny rootlets reached out from the wound. A sharp, penetrating cold, utterly unnatural, emanated from the mark, seeping inward toward his heart. His fingers, he noticed, grew cold, rapidly lost all sensation, became numb. Alien things that no longer felt like his own. It was a physical manifestation of the transformation, undeniable and terrifying, a grotesque flowering of the infection within him. They stopped at last, the car out of gas, surrounded by an absolute, oppressive silence that pressed down from the towering pines. Matt knew then, with a chilling certainty that bypassed all thought and reason, the strike would come. It was logical, the inevitable conclusion of their desperate flight, the final, terrifying piece of their horrifying system. He was the next element, the next brick in the relentless, expanding construction of the colony. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, and he waited, heart-pounding, for the inevitable. Dawn did not break. Instead, the forest was swallowed by a thick, oppressive gray fog that unnaturally settled over the land, clinging to the trees, muffling all sound. The air was heavy, dense, so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool, carrying with it the sickening taste of smoke and that now ubiquitous, cloying smell of rust. It was a landscape of purgatory, a suffocating shroud drawn over a world about to end. Then, from the impenetrable depths of the fog, the final whistle sounded. Not one, but 3 distinct signals, short, authoritative, piercing through the dense air, each one coming from a different direction, surrounding them completely. A short, chopped realization slammed into Matt. Command to attack. The signals were not random calls. They were orders, delivered with the cold precision of a general directing his troops. Matt looked down at his hand, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The faint mark on his wrist, now an angry blue, pulsed with a sickening rhythm. Around it, the gray network had spread, a chilling spider web pattern crawling up his forearm. His fingers grew colder, rapidly lost all sensation, became numb, alien things that no longer felt like his own. The transformation was undeniable, a grotesque metamorphosis unfolding in real time. Then, a profound, terrifying realization, colder and more absolute than the fog, descended upon Matt. These were not merely monsters, not simply beasts of folklore. This was a mechanism, a self-sustaining process that operated on a level beyond biology, rooted in the fundamental laws of physics. It was a natural process, utterly alien to humanity, one that systematically reprogrammed reality itself, changing the very definition of life and existence. It was a cosmic horror, vast and indifferent, beyond any human comprehension or resistance. John looked at Matt, his eyes, usually so impassive, now filled with a deep, crushing sorrow. He saw the coldness blooming in Matt's own eyes, the vacant yellow flickered within the human irises. He understood. John raised his hunting rifle, the worn stock familiar in his hands. The action was short, precise, accented by a profound, terrible finality. "Sorry, Matt," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that spanned years. The deep, guttural sound of the rifle shot tore through the thick fog, a violent punctuation mark in the oppressive silence, followed by a sickening thud. Matt woke in the sterile, disorienting brightness of civilization, wounded but alive, left behind. He was in a hospital, then a small, anonymous apartment in a different state, miles from Dudley, Maine. He wrote the article, the truth painstakingly detailed, imbued with the taste of ash and iron, but it was never published. His editor, Steve, sent a final, terse email, unsubstantiated, further communication not required. Matt believed in his wrist, in the persistent phantom cold that still radiated from it, in the faint bluish mark that remained etched into his skin. He lives an ordinary life now, in a city far from the deep woods. He has a job, pays his bills, drinks cheap coffee from a plastic cup. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the city is quiet, he hears a rustle, a soft, synchronized tap, a faint echo of the noiseless tread. He stops breathing, utterly still. He knows the truth. The mark on his wrist, now pale and almost imperceptible, remains a clear, permanent reminder. The hunt continues, and he, Matt Harper, bears its eternal mark.